It's time to talk about the Disney Silver Age, so off we go! Hello everyone, welcome back to How to Train Your Gavin. Today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my From Book to Disney Adaptation video series. Last time I took a deep dive into the golden age era of Walt Disney animation and examined the original source materials that inspired Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi. In this video, I will be looking at Disney's Silver Age, or at least the first part of it, because there were quite a few films released in this era. I've decided to focus on 4 of those films that were released from 1950 to 1959. And for 2 of them, I had to read 2 or 3 of the original fairy tales that inspired the movie, because the movies took elements from each one. Firstly, I will discuss Cinderella, and comparing it to 2 fairy tales, one by Charles Perrault and the other one by the brothers Grimm. Then I will discuss Alice in Wonderland, and then comparing it to the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Then I will look at Peter Pan and the book of the same name by J.M. Barrie. And then finally Sleeping Beauty, and I read 3 versions of the original fairy tale for this one, including Sun, Moon and Talia by G.M. Baptiste Basile, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault, and Little Briar Rose by the brothers Grimm. Lady and the Tramp was also released in this era in 1955, but that was based on a Cosmopolitan magazine story called Happy Dan the Cynical Dog by Ward Green. So as I am unable to read it, I will not be able to feature it in my From Book to Disney Adaptation series. In a part 2 of the Silver Age video coming up, I will look at the rest of the Silver Age movies which came out between 1961 and 1970, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified when that goes up, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoy it. So with all the pleasantries out of the way, let's get into talking about the Disney movies and the original source materials. Now Cinderella begins the Silver Age in 1950, and the origins of the Cinderella story dates a lot further back than the versions I read for this video. The ones I read for this video were the 1697 version by Charles Perrault and the much darker 1812 version by the brothers Grimm. And when I tell you it's darker, it is so much darker, oh my gosh. So the movie Cinderella tells the story of Cinderella, who is left under the care of her wicked stepmother and her stepsisters after the death of her father. The wicked Lady Tremaine and Cinderella's ugly stepsisters, Anastasia and Drusilla, do work Cinderella to the bone. But Cinderella also has the help of her animal friends to get by, so I mean, Alicia's got company. Now the king announces an elaborate ball of which all eligible maidens in the kingdom are to attend, so that the prince may find himself a bride. Lady Tremaine will not allow Cinderella to go to the ball, so Cinderella then seeks comfort in her fairy godmother, who casts a spell to allow Cinderella to go to the ball. However, the spell will be broken at midnight. When fleeing the ball, Cinderella accidentally leaves the glass slipper. Using only this glass slipper, the prince tries to find Cinderella, and so tries it on every maiden in the kingdom, until eventually Cinderella is found and they live happily ever after. Not exactly the end, because Cinderella 2 and 3 are also amazing. Give them a watch if you haven't already. Huge props to Cinderella 3, because it's like just as good as the original if you ask me. This one is slightly more difficult to talk about because there are multiple origin stories of Cinderella, but yes, I will only talk about the Perrault and the Grimm version, and you can tell that the Walt Disney adaptation really does take liberties in giving Cinderella this whimsical fairy tale. However, I think what Walt Disney did so well is to retain that Cinderella story of rags to riches, of a girl who stays kind against really tough and brutal situations and is rewarded by the end, which is awesome. The film, possibly inspired by Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, incorporated a lot more animal, scenes than the books ever did, making the film Cinderella more like Tom and Jerry. The only animals that are really featured in the Perrault version are the ones that the godmother turns from, like mice into horses, lizard into a footman, things like that. Those are really the only animals that appear in that version. However, the Grimm version is a lot more prominent because we have Cinderella in that version who is actually able to talk to animals and get them to help her with her chores. So for instance, the stepmother in the Grimm version, she throws lentils into the ashes of a fire and tells her to sort them because Cinderella really wants to go to the ball, and the only way her stepmother will allow her to do that is if she sorts out these lentils, and she thinks it's going to take her a few hours. However, Cinderella does call upon the help of pigeons and the birds of the sky to cut her task in half so that she can go to the ball. However, her stepmother is still adamant that she cannot go because she doesn't have the right attire for it. Now what the movie does with the characters, especially of like Lady Tremaine. They tone Lady Tremaine down because the stepmother is really awful in the Grimm version, but the stepsisters aren't really all that bad. They do treat Cinderella cruelly, but unlike the movie, they do not tear Cinderella's dress when she's trying to go to the ball, which was always a scene that like scarred me as a kid. Like, I was terrified of that scene, and just like the savagery of the stepsisters, like none of that really is in the book. I mean, yes, they are horrible and nasty people, but not in the same malicious way as the movie portrays them. So speaking of the dress then, and I guess we should probably talk about the fairy godmother. So in the Perrault version, the fairy godmother does appear, and she does help Cinderella get to the ball. Now in the Grimm version, there is no fairy godmother. Instead, birds from the sky drop a dress for Cinderella instead, which sounds a little bit more silly. Now Cinderella, she does go to her mother's grave and she cries there and she chants, "Shiver and quiver little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." And that is when the birds drop a dress down for her. So there is no like pumpkin into carriage kind of scene. There's no mice into horses kind of scene in the Grimm version, whereas there is in the Perrault version. So you can kind of see the differences in these versions already. Both versions of the fairy tale as well, the Perrault and the Grimm versions, has the ball lasting several days. So in the Perrault version, I think it lasts 2 days, and in the Grimm version, it's 3 days. So we don't really get that tense escape from the castle. I mean, saying that, she does still have until midnight in each version to leave the ball. In the Grimm version, she just wants to go home, but in the Perrault version, at midnight, the spell will break, and Cinderella will be left in her rags, and the pumpkin will turn back, and the mice will turn back. So all of that is in the Perrault version. So I can definitely see how the Perrault version was the main inspiration for the movie. Whereas with the Grimm's version, I think the live action Cinderella with Lily James was more inspired by the Grimm version, because we also have a little bit more story with her father, especially with the tree branch kind of brushing his shoulder, and that's the only gift Cinderella wants him to bring back to her, whereas the stepsisters are asking for like gold and silk and all of that kind of stuff. In the Perrault version, Cinderella leaves behind her glass slipper in haste, whereas in the Grimm version, the king's son puts down pitch on the stairs of the palace, which is, you know, giving me Into the Woods kind of vibes right now. And Cinderella has no option but to leave her shoe because it's stuck. So what I think the movie does so well is, I mean, one, it has the music. So This Is Love, you definitely feel her falling in love with the prince, and even though it's still like way too quick for that to happen, you do still feel charmed and enchanted by the magic and the romance that's happening in that moment. Whereas in the fairy tale versions, I don't feel anything. But then you do get the seriousness of Cinderella's situation from her escape from the ball. So with the slipper situation then, in the Perrault version, it happens really easily. So the gentleman who goes around and tries a slipper on the princess's feet and all of the eligible maidens' feet, he tries it on the stepsisters first, but it doesn't fit, obviously. And then Cinderella sees it, she laughs, she recognizes it, they try it on her, and it fits, and they live happily ever after. Cinderella forgives her stepsisters with her whole heart, and it's quite a warming end to the story. In the Grimm version though, oh my gosh, that is definitely not the case. The stepmother seems to just vanish in the Perrault version, but in the Grimm version, she plays a huge role in the end of the story. So when the gentleman is coming around trying the shoes on, you know, all of the maidens, the stepmother takes her stepsisters into different rooms when they're trying the shoe on, and she tells them to mutilate their feet because they won't need their feet when they're married to the prince, right? So she gives them the knife, and for one of them she tells her, cut the toe off, when you are queen you will have no more need to go on foot. So the first stepsister does cut off her toe, puts the shoe on, it's bleeding everywhere, but you know, the prince doesn't say it, and then he's riding away with her, and when they pass Cinderella's mother's grave, there are a couple of birds that chant, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe it is too small for her, the true bride waits for you. And the prince says that there's blood everywhere, takes her back, and the other stepsister goes into the room with her stepmother, tries it on, and then the stepmother gives her a knife and says, cut a bit off your heel, when you are queen you will have no more need to go on foot. So again, you know, the stepsister cuts off her heel and rides away with the prince, gets to Cinderella's mother's grave, and the birds chant that chant again. The prince sees the blood and then takes her back. So then Cinderella tries the shoe on, and honestly, if I was Cinderella in that moment, I would take one look at that bloody shoe and be like, look, you can keep your wedding, you can keep your $1 million state, I'm out. Because imagine putting on a shoe after two of your sisters have bled into it. And it's not even just a little bit of blood, it's literal blood running from the shoe. It's honestly so unhygienic. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is when we're at Cinderella's wedding and the stepsisters come and pigeons end up pecking out their eyes to punish them for their wickedness. And then what happens to the stepmother? Nobody knows. She gets away scot-free. So fortunately, we didn't really have any of the kind of comeuppance for the stepsisters or the stepmother in the movie. We do get a little bit more in Cinderella 2 and 3, but I mean, I don't want to go into those, even though I think they're great films. But yeah, it's definitely a lot darker. I could only imagine Anastasia and Drusilla like cutting off their feet in the Disney version. It wouldn't go down well with the kids. So you can definitely say that it was the Perrault version that inspired the 1950 film of Cinderella rather than the Grimm's fairy tale version of it. But I still wanted to talk about the Grimm's fairy tale version in this video because I think that version definitely helped embellish the story of Cinderella and then inspired more of the live action version of it. But also just because I find the darker ones a lot more entertaining until we get to Sleeping Beauty later, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So after Cinderella, we had Alice in Wonderland in 1951. That one is based on the classic children's story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which was released in 1865. Alice in Wonderland tells the story of a very bored little girl who sees a white rabbit in a waistcoat and a pocket watch running along the riverbanks and ends up following him into a rabbit hole, falls down it, and ends up in Wonderland. Wonderland is this very nonsensical place where she meets Tweedledum and Tweedledee, she meets the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter and the March Hare, the Queen of Hearts, and everything else in between. There is just a lot of nonsense going on in the movie, and you can tell it was definitely inspired by the book. I think, if anything, of all the Silver Age movies in this video, Alice in Wonderland was probably the best adaptation because it retained all of that nonsense that the book had. Like, it's so hard to explain just how nonsensical the book and the movie is. But of course, there are a lot of differences as well as similarities in the movie and the original book. I mean, a lot of the similarities come from the fact that a lot of the plot and even like exact moments were taken out of the book and put straight into the movie. So we do still have Alice falling down the rabbit hole. We see Alice get to the door where she has to drink something to get smaller and eat something to get larger. And you know, she cries the river of tears. Like, all of that is in there. There's also different lines that are pulled straight out of the book into the movie. Like the one about, I give very good advice, but I very seldom follow it, which is like one of my favorite lines from the movie, actually. One thing I think the movie did well was that it made Alice a lot more likable. In the book, Alice just kept being very whiny for one, but I mean, I guess, you know, she is a kid and she's in a whole new place, and that's fine. But it's the fact that she would offend a lot of the people she'd meet, and then she would be like, oh, I wish you weren't so easily offended. Well, Alice, stop offending people. There weren't any talking flowers either that kind of ridiculed Alice in the book. However, there was a pigeon that she meets, and the pigeon is asking Alice what she is, and when she tries to tell her she's a little girl, the pigeon's like, no, you're not, you're a serpent, which we do get in the movie, but it happened in a bit of a different way. Serpent, serpent. There are some like really nice touches in the movie as well. We get some character names dropped in, like Bill the Lizard. He is in the book and the movie, but he doesn't really have the biggest part in the movie, but it's kind of like a nice touch. It's the same with the White Rabbit's kind of maid called Marianne. The White Rabbit mistakes Alice for Marianne in both the movie and the book, which again is like another small detail, but I kind of like that. However, Tweedledum and Tweedledee were not from the original Alice's Adventures in Wonderland book, but rather the sequel Through the Looking Glass and what Alice found there. So there were parts of the sequel that inspired the movie, especially those characters. One of the biggest differences though in the movie from the book is that the Duchess does not appear. In one part of the book, Alice lets herself into a stranger's house because that's just what Alice does. And the house belongs to the Duchess and she has this crying baby. There is also a cook who is putting too much pepper in everything and it's making everyone sneeze but the cook and the Cheshire Cat. And when Alice holds this baby, it turns into a pig. So we don't have that interaction at all in the movie. It's so interesting though, just how faithful the movie is to pretty much a lot of the other things in there as well, because we also get the Mad Tea Party, which the famous riddle, why is there even like a writing desk, quote comes from. I also love the kind of little touch about how time has kind of cursed the Mad Hatter to always be at 6 p.m, which is always daytime. I love that explanation of it. I don't know why the movie cut it out. However, that is investigated more in the Tim Burton version of the movies. But I do like just how faithful like the tea party was when Alice meets the Queen and the croquet matches and things, how there are flamingos and hedgehogs and how that all stays the same. There is, of course, you know, different versions. Like there isn't a, oh, what's that part in the film that really scarred me? The Walrus and the Carpenter. That's it. The Walrus and Carpenter story doesn't happen in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. However, in this one we do have this mock turtle and griffin that tells Alice like stories and songs and things, but I'm kind of glad they cut out the whole mock turtle and griffin thing because that part was boring. However, we do get to the trial and there were changes actually. So the trial isn't Alice on the stand like in the film. The trial is instead how the Jack of Hearts stole the Queen's tarts. But a lot of the things that happens during the trial happens in the movie. So we have like a jury that is just writing nonsense. We have the Queen wanting a sentence before any of the evidence is given. We have loads of different things with the King and him wanting to take control of the court. And it just all like fits so well. Like I can picture the movie as I'm reading the book. Yes, there are still differences, but a lot of it is pretty much the same. And of course the end of the book is pretty much the same as the movie, except the movie makes it a lot more cinematic. So we have Alice running away from the trial. Everyone's chasing after her until eventually she wakes up and she talks with her sister and they go. So in the book, Alice just throws some cards and she immediately wakes up in her sister's lap and tells her sister about her adventures. So we don't have that whole chase sequence that we have in the movie, unfortunately. So all in all, I think the Alice in Wonderland movie did such a good job at adapting the book. You still had all the nonsense, you still had the characters, or at least the more important characters. You had the characters' important catchphrases and their mannerisms and characterizations. That's all present. But in my opinion, it was pretty faithful. So going on to Peter Pan then. Peter Pan was released theatrically in 1953 and was inspired by the character created by J.M. Barrie. Now, the character of Peter Pan appeared in various forms of media beforehand, including a 1904 play called Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, before becoming an expanded published novel in 1911 under the name of Peter and Wendy. Peter Pan tells the story of a young boy who never grows up in Neverland. He goes to London and he comes across the Darling children, Wendy, Michael and John, and with Tinkerbell takes them to Neverland, where there are pirates and mermaids, and there is like this fight between Peter Pan and Captain Hook, and eventually Wendy and her brothers realize that they should return home where they potentially have to grow up. Peter Pan is filled with incredible imagination, and I do love the idea behind Peter Pan. Now I'm going to lay into this book and movie because, well, Richard gave me a pathetic review of my pathetic review. There are just so many problematic things about, well, the movie and the book. I'd never read the book before, so this was my first time, and oh my god, I hated it so much. Now, the movie I had seen as a kid, and unfortunately it doesn't hold up to that wonder that I thought it had when I was little. I do like how Disney Plus included a sort of updated beginning to Peter Pan with a card explaining that there is poor representation of Native Americans in the movie, just as it should. It's terrible. And same with the book, like even more so in the book. It's far more upsetting and unsettling in the book. Let's start at the beginning though, and what positive things can come from Peter Pan. Now, for the book Peter Pan, I did actually prefer the start of it, where there's a bit more focus on Mrs. Darling, you know, Wendy, John and Michael's mother. There's kind of like this introduction of imagination and magic before we even get to Neverland. So it's kind of just like how she rummages through their minds when she puts them to bed, and she sorts out all of their imagination and the more mischievous thoughts and things so that when they wake up they can just put it straight back on. Little details like that were really nice and imaginative, and I liked that. I liked that a lot. And we also have Mrs. Darling coming across Nana, who has, well, Nana's still a servant dog in the book, and Nana has caught Peter Pan's shadow. So instead of Wendy catching the shadow in the movie, it's actually Nana and Mrs. Darling who come across the shadow first. Even that opening scene is mostly adapted quite well in the movie, so we still have the father being ridiculous and wanting Wendy to grow up and leave the nursery, and also with Nana, poor Nana, there's the whole sequence with the dad being not so great. So that was adapted pretty well. And then Peter and Tinkerbell come along. I hate Peter Pan and Tinkerbell in the book, like, so much. Like, they are awful. Like, in the movie, yes, Peter Pan is still cocky. Yes, Tinkerbell has a lot of sass. But in the book, they're so much more insufferable. Tinkerbell, oh my god, she has the worst potty mouth. I don't know how kids are allowed to read this these days, but every single time something happens, Tinkerbell calls someone a silly ass. Like, she actually uses that word. I mean, it's hilarious. It is hilarious, but I'm an adult. Okay, I can find that funny. But if it's a kid reading this and they say, you silly ass, and like literally Tinkerbell says that all the time. All the time. Like after like she gets the Lost Boys to shoot Wendy down from the sky, which the movie does as well, but Tinkerbell wants to actually kill Wendy in the book, like actually kill her. Tinkerbell goes to the Lost Boys and laughs and says, you silly ass, and then goes away. Like, it's just, I mean, it's funny, but no, it's terrible. Even when Peter Pan thinks that Tinkerbell wants to be his mother, he says, perhaps Tink wants to be my mother. You silly ass, cried Tinkerbell in a passion. But that's all she says. In the movie, we have Tinkerbell saving Peter Pan from this bomb that goes off, whereas in the book, Captain Hook has left him poison. Tinkerbell ends up drinking the poison instead of him, and as she's slowly dying, Peter Pan says, oh Tink, did you drink it to save me? Yes. But why, Tink? Her wings would scarcely carry her now, but in reply she alighted on his shoulder and gave his nose a loving bite. She whispered in his ear, you silly ass, and then, tottering to her chamber, lay down on the bed. And then that's when the whole, like, do you believe in fairies thing happens, which is great in the book. Like, that's fab. Like, I love the kind of incorporation of, you know, the reader's imagination. That's kind of all left out in the movie. I'm imagining that was part of the pantomime because, you know, it's getting audience participation. So I can kind of say that. Honestly, just, what a potty mouth Tinkerbell has. But it's so inappropriate for kids. And not even just her potty mouth, but also we have fairies having orgies too. And Peter Pan, and this is on page 61 of my edition, after a time he fell asleep and some unsteady fairies had to climb over him on their way home from an orgy. The fact that they're unsteady as well is just, like, surely that should have been rewritten, or, like, you know, just like the word change or something. It might have meant something totally different back then, but again, we are modern readers, we are giving these books to our children, or, you know, in my case, my niece and nephews. Do I really want them to read about fairies having orgies and fairies yelling you silly ass every now and then? No. But there's just so much girl on girl hate, and like even in the movie it's so insufferable. Like Tinkerbell's hatred for Wendy, it's actually a little bit scary, but in the book it's even worse. She really does want the Lost Boys to kill Wendy, and what's really sad is that in both the book and the movie there's no like rectification of it. There's no kind of moral learned from it. Like Tinkerbell doesn't ever apologize to Wendy or make up for it. So like if Tinkerbell had just saved Wendy at one point, then that would have been a sort of like an apology almost. But no, none of that happens. And even the mermaids hate Wendy with a passion too. And all because of Peter Pan, because he's the most insufferable character ever. Like, he's supposed to be a young boy. He still has all of his baby teeth. And that's like a really disturbing mental picture in my head. Especially since he's like maybe like 100 or so years old. Because there have been stories told for generations about how Peter Pan, when a child dies, he takes them and goes at least halfway to take them to the afterlife. So Peter Pan has been around for a long time. Why is everyone so in love with him and enamored by him? When you do hear about J.M. Barrie's past and kind of the story behind Peter Pan, it becomes that more disturbing. Now, I don't want to talk about those assumptions or J.M. Barrie as a person in this video because I feel like this would need a video all on its own, but it does really unsettle me what happened in real life and the inspirations behind Peter Pan, and the infatuation of Peter is so creepy to me. And Peter as well, he's just an awful person. He kills Lost Boys. Like, he culls them. When he thinks they're like growing up and things, like he kills them. They also have to make believe food. So if they're starving, they just have to make believe it's there. Which kind of reminds me of Hook a little bit, which honestly is a superior film to Peter Pan. So watch that instead. So Smee in the movie is, you know, kind of that silly sidekick character, but in the book he actually abuses kids and he like hits them with his hand and he takes like such glee from it. And trigger warnings for child abuse. so if you don't want to hear this quote being read, please do skip ahead to maybe the next section. But with Smee, it says, feared him, feared Smee. There was not a child on board the brig that night who did not already love him. He had said horrid things to them and hit them with the palm of his hand, because he could not hit with his fist, but they had only clung to him the more. And that kind of forcefulness on children, and for them to only love him the more, so that is really dark and triggering as well. Like, there's something really sinister about that, and again, it's like probably a bit too big for me to unpack in this video. Hook is pretty much kind of similar. He's like sinister, he's awful, and I think the movie portrays him probably the best out of all the characters. A couple of spoiler warnings is that Captain Hook and Tinkerbell die. Hook ends up having this really grisly death. And what's, again, like shows how Peter is an awful character is that a year later when Peter visits Wendy after she's back home, she asks him about Captain Hook, but he can't remember him. He says, "Who is Captain Hook? I forget them after I kill them." And then Wendy also asks about Tinkerbell, and he says, "Who is Tinkerbell?" It's told that fairies don't actually live that long, so Tinkerbell's died, but like it's the fact that Peter just doesn't remember Tinkerbell, doesn't remember Captain Hook, and he's just so self-absorbed. Honestly, the worst person. But the worst part about this book and the worst part about Peter is the representation of Native Americans. So the Indian tribe in Neverland are a group of indigenous people who lived in Neverland. I cannot repeat what is said in the book, like the words that are used to describe them, the way that they're represented. I genuinely do not want to repeat what's said in the book or even talk about what happened in the movie, but what is so like awful as well is how imperialistic Peter Pan is with them, and just how much J.M. Barrie puts an emphasis on white supremacy. It's honestly disgusting and repugnant. When Peter Pan saves Tiger Lily, the indigenous people end up making Peter Pan their leader. They worship him, they bow down to him. Reading that just made me feel like physically sick, especially because of the history of, well, British imperialism. That part of history makes me so ashamed to be British, for one. But two, to have this in a children's book as well and be so awfully portrayed, again, is like, why is this still read today? There are way better books out there. These children's classics, seriously, need to go. That entire scene with the Indians just made me realize Peter Pan actually is one of the worst characters I've ever read in a book ever. And then the whole cycle of kidnapping continues with Wendy at the end and her daughter Jane, which we do see a little bit of in the sequel to Peter Pan, which I think was called Return to Neverland. But again, with the kind of creepy backstory of Peter Pan and J.M. Barrie, like that just makes it all the more sinister, and I don't like it one bit. So what I think the movie of Peter Pan did well was take the imagination and the essence of Neverland and turned it into something that was a little bit more kid-friendly. However, it still is rooted in racism, and I really despise a lot of the things that the film shows, but I despise so much more of what the book does. But I mean, the animation is amazing, I guess. Like, well done animators, but that story needed work. And honestly, there are way better adaptations of Peter Pan. Again, Hook, watch it. So finally, after that rant, we come to the end of the first part of the Silver Age, which is Sleeping Beauty, which was released in 1959. It is based on several variations of the Sleeping Beauty story, and the ones I read for this video, and there are 3 that I read for this video. The first one was Sun, Moon and Talia by Giambattista Basile, which was released in 1634, and then Charles Perrault retold the story in 1697 called The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, and then finally the Grimm's fairy tale version of it in 1812 called Sleeping Beauty, Little Briar Rose. It has different titles, but that was what it was called for the version I read. So Sleeping Beauty tells a story of a king and queen who give birth to Aurora. Upon celebrating the birth, everyone in the kingdom is invited, apart from the evil fairy Maleficent. Maleficent curses Aurora and tells them that on her 16th birthday, when she pricks her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel, she will die. However, the 3 good fairies soften the blow of that curse and takes Aurora away to live with them for 15 years. On her 16th birthday, they take Aurora back to the castle and essentially hand her over to the villain. Aurora does prick her finger and she falls into a deep sleep. The good fairies makes everyone fall asleep and seeks out Prince Philip, who Aurora had met earlier that day. And though he has been captured by Maleficent, they help him escape. And after a dragon battle with Maleficent, Prince Philip wakes Aurora and the curse has been broken and everyone has reawakened. So, The original fairy tale. Now, the Sun, Moon and Talia version, which was the original version that I found anyway, was not the one that inspired Sleeping Beauty. However, I do think it's still important to talk about because it inspired the Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm versions, which Sleeping Beauty the movie was inspired by. So there is this whole web of inspiration going on at the minute. Sun, Moon and Talia is honestly horrific. Honestly horrific. It was that horrific that even the Brothers Grimm, and they're known for their really twisted fairy tales, it was too wicked for even them. So in Sun, Moon and Talia, Talia is actually not cursed by an evil fairy. Instead, there is this like splinter of flax that is predicted to endanger her life through horoscopes and things like that. So then Talia ends up coming across an old woman who is spinning flax, and some of that flax goes under her fingernail and she drops down. The king ends up putting her in this country house where he leaves her. I don't know why, he just leaves her there, never checks on her or anything. But then, sometime later, a king comes along, and this is where it gets really messed up. So this king, he ends up going into the house, right? And this is what it says. At last he came to the salon, and when the king beheld Talia, who seemed to be enchanted, he believed that she was asleep, and he called her, but she remained unconscious. Crying aloud, he beheld her charms and felt his blood course hotly through his veins. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to a bed, where he gathered the first fruits of love, and then he leaves. And women were criticized, especially in that time period of like the 1600s and 1700s, of being overcome with sensibility and being like women of feeling and, you know, fainting at every opportunity because they're so overcome with sensibility. And men cannot control themselves, and it's the women who are to blame. Really? Honestly, there's so much to unpack there. It's a problem that still runs today, and it would take hours upon hours to unpack. I really, really want to say everything I think about how absolutely disgusting and repugnant this whole thing is. And then eventually Talia does give birth to twins. And that is just so messed up on so many levels, and so believable as well. It's a fairy tale, but it's so believable because men are pigs. Men are pigs. Anyway, one of the babies ends up sucking out the piece of flax from under Talia's fingernail, and she wakes. The king comes back to them and he falls in love with her, but he is actually already married to a queen. So then the queen finds out about it. She invites the two children to come to the castle, orders the cook to cook them so that she can feed the children to the king. However, the cook betrays her and cooks something else instead. And then the queen invites Talia to come over and threatens to burn her, but then the king comes, saves her. Talia and the king live happily ever after. That whole section with the cooking the children and wanting to kill Talia is also not in the movie. In the movie, we have Aurora, who is betrothed to Prince Philip as soon as she is born. So there is at least some kind of romance tension between Aurora and Prince Philip. You know, they saw each other once upon a dream, and they do love one another. Whereas, you know, obviously in the Sun, Moon and Talia version, it's oh my god, it's awful. It's awful. But even the whole thing with the queen inviting the children along to kill them and cook them and stuff, fortunately, Sleeping Beauty in the movie cut out as soon as Aurora woke up and was dancing and her dress was turning pink and blue. That was all cut out, thank God. But we do see the Perrault version also incorporate all of this. So starting from the beginning, the Perrault version then, there's 12 fairies invited to Aurora's birth, and the aged fairy is not. But to be fair, everyone thought that the aged fairy was dead because nobody had seen her in 50 years, so I can kind of see why. But it isn't even the fact that she wasn't invited that makes her curse Aurora. Or I don't actually think she's called Aurora in this, I think she's just called the princess. Because she was uninvited, they didn't actually have like a gold plate for her, but they still like provide her a plate, it just wasn't gold, and that is what makes the aged fairy go off. That's what makes her want to kill this baby. Fair. So then she does kiss the princess, but it's not flax, it's, you know, the spindle of a spinning wheel. And there's no like mention when that's going to happen, so I can totally see why everyone's like worried. But then, like the Sun, Moon and Talia version, the princess comes across an old woman spinning in a random room in the castle, and she pricks her finger, falls asleep, but the king and queen fall asleep with her. As the princess is sleeping, thorns have covered the castle, but when the prince who is destined to wake her 100 years later comes along, he can easily go through, it makes way for him, and then he wakes up the princess. But then that's not the end of that story either. So in the Perrault version, it's not the prince's wife that wants to kill the children and the princess. It is instead the prince's mother, the queen. And the queen turns out to be an ogress, and she wants to cook the children and and eat them herself, but the cook again betrays her and gives her lamb instead, and then the ogress wants to eat the princess, and instead he cooks a dough and gives her that. Then the queen realizes that she has been betrayed and makes this cauldron of snakes and toads and wants to throw them all in it. However, the prince saves the day and the queen throws herself into this cauldron of vipers, and it's rather grisly. What's funny is the Grimm's fairy tale version out of all of them is the most tame, and that's really strange because Grimm's fairy tales have always been the darkest, but not in this one. It's actually very short. It is essentially the movie, because all that happens is Aurora is cursed, the evil fairy tells her that she will prick her finger in her 15th year, and then it happens, everyone falls asleep, the prince finds her 100 years later, wakes her up, they lived happily ever after. Literally, that is it. There's no kind of queen wanting to kill and eat people. What the movie does then is so bizarre, because in the movie, for some reason, the fairies take Aurora away from her parents for 15 years, and then on her 16th birthday, the day she's destined to prick her finger, they take her back to the castle, literally in the hands of the villain, and she ends up being hypnotized, going through the castle towards the spindle, which is honestly my favourite scene from the movie, and the prophecy comes true. Honestly, the fairies were absolutely idiotic. I don't even understand why they had to take her for 15 years. Literally, Maleficent says on her 16th birthday she'll prick her finger and die. Why not maybe the day before her 16th birthday they take her away on a little trip? Maybe, and then bring her back the day after her 16th birthday? Not on the day of her 16th birthday. Like, that was just... Why? Why? Like, I genuinely don't understand. Like, the logic in the Sleeping Beauty movie just isn't there. It isn't there. It doesn't make sense. However, the best part of the Sleeping Beauty movie is obviously Maleficent. And unfortunately, the evil fairy is never embellished in the fairy tale versions. In fact, she only ever really appears once. It is always just a random old woman who is spinning, very innocently, the stuff that she's spinning. I don't even know what it is she's spinning. But it's never actually Maleficent who is ever present again, which is sad because, yeah, Maleficent is definitely the best part of Sleeping Beauty. The movie definitely made, I think, at least in my opinion, the Sleeping Beauty tale better. Definitely better than the Sun, Moon and Talia version, which was just all kinds of messed up. And then it did cut away the whole queen wanting to eat the children and the princess, which could have been an interesting film. It could have made an interesting film, not gonna lie. We have Prince Philip as a more fleshed out character as well in Sleeping Beauty, so he's actually someone who knows Aurora, whereas in the fairy tales, the curse actually does last 100 years, and the prince is somebody we don't know, somebody who even the princess doesn't know, which again is very problematic. But again, Sleeping Beauty has incredible animation. It's just so beautiful to look at, and again has some of the best scenes in a Disney film, I think, like the whole thorn scene and the dragon fight with Maleficent. Even though Prince Philip cheated in that fight, Maleficent would have won had the fairies not, intervened. So that was unfair. But yeah, other than that, Sleeping Beauty just ran away with the whole story and made it its own, which was actually really great for it to do. Out of all of the movies and books that I've talked about in this video, I would say Sleeping Beauty is definitely the most different of all of them, whereas Alice in Wonderland was the most faithful. Peter Pan was rather faithful, kind of made things a little bit better, but it was still terrible. And Cinderella made that story more Tom and Jerry than anything else. The live action Cinderella is probably a better adaptation, but I'm not here to talk about the live action films. Not yet anyway. So that was my video discussing Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan and Sleeping Beauty, the first part, or at least the first decade of the Silver Age of Walt Disney animation. In the next part, I will be looking at the second part of the Silver Age. I will be looking at 101 Dalmatians, The Sword in the Stone, and The Jungle Book. So I'm really excited about that video, but if you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to give it a like, leave a comment down below, let me know what you thought of these movies and books if you've read them. I would love to know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future content, and I will hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!